then I guess it is time for our first session. So good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to get to be like kind of the first full session of the day for Data Toboggan today. And today we will be kicking off the day with kind of getting a proper overview of Azure Synapse and also understanding what we use each of the components of Azure Synapse for and how we combine those together to make your own solution for a data platform project that you're working on. So welcome to the ultimate Jigsaw, architecting Azure Synapse Analytics. And as it was mentioned in the keynote, Synapse was published, first came out about a year and a half ago. Of course, it wasn't yet in general availability, I mean. But when I heard about it, I of course right away dashed to the portal and went looking for Synapse Analytics and was going inside of my head like, yay, it's there. But of course, after a little bit, I realized when I had it up that, well, no, this is not quite all the cool new features that I was expecting. This is the old data warehouse that has just changed names overnight. So it wasn't quite the full-fledged Synapse Analytics that we're going to talk about today. And so fast forward to now, it's been about a year and a half. A lot has happened. The service has gone to general availability. And of course, it's kind of a fresh new service. So there's a whole lot going on all the time and new improvements coming in and so forth. So it is evolving a lot. So it's kind of the perfect time to really get your grasps on all the foundational pieces, because that will help you keep up with all the changes coming up as well. So now if you go to the portal, what you'll find is that you will kind of more easily find Azure Synapse Analytics there. There's some other stuff showing up, but it kind of makes sense that it's the one that just says Azure Synapse Analytics, so it's easy to find. And so once you put the service up, what you end up with is kind of this service that has a lot of components to it. And you see that there's SQL pools and a PushSpark pools, and countless kind of settings that you need to go through in the portal. And of course, it can be a little bit to get your head around and to understand what is each of these components for. So to really help you with that, we're going to start today with getting our grip on the components of Azure Synapse Analytics first. Then as the second part, we will then go into how you actually secure Azure Synapse Analytics, because when we're kind of playing around and demoing, it can be really easy. We don't have any of those like enterprise requirements. But at some point when you go full in, you need to consider networking and access control, for example, and other things. But those are the two ones that we're mainly going to focus on today. And then lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to go through how to use Azure Synapse Analytics. So really, just walking through an example of how you would pick the pieces that you're going to use and how you are going to take also the parts from the second portion and figure out what's your right option for you. So I'm Heini Ilmarinen. I work as a DevOps consultant at Polar Squad, which is a small Finnish company that does just DevOps consulting. I am a very freshly awarded Microsoft MVP in the data platform side, so I do a lot of speaking around. I also am a Microsoft certified trainer and run some trainings around Azure. My favorite topic, as you might also see in this session, is kind of bringing the architecture twist to any topic that I talk about. It's kind of my favorite topic to talk how you actually make the pieces work together. And lastly, I am a bit of a math nerd at heart. I used to study mathematics, and so if anyone wants to chat with me about mathematics, just send me a message. I'll gladly have that conversation. And lastly, I'm a bit of a serial doodler, which you might see along the slides here as well. But let's get started with the overview of Azure Synapse Analytics. So when we talk about Azure Synapse Analytics, as we kind of discussed in the beginning, it is kind of a lot of pieces. There's the pipelines there is the dedicated SQL pools, you can find private endpoints and linked services, then you have the PushSpark pool, and you also have the serverless SQL pool, and this is not even all of the components that you can find within Azure Synapse Analytics. So it can be a little bit difficult to realize how to start, what do you put where, which piece do you use for which purpose, etc. And before we go into kind of what is each component for, I want to step back and really look at the flow of kind of a traditional data platform project that you might be working on. So when we think about the flow of a data platform project, we of course start with some kind of data sources. We probably aren't going to start working on a data platform project unless there is some kind of data we want to work with. We might have that data on premises, in other cloud services, etc. But there's some kind of data sources that we want to use that data for a certain purpose. And to get to the end result of actually being able to use it for a certain purpose, we of course first need to do something to that data. So as the first step, we need to ingest that data. So we need to pull that data in from the data source and pull it into our data platform. And to be able to put it somewhere, we of course need a storage layer. And that is where which will be our central storage, where all our data is going to come into and also move out of and into in between all of these steps that we go through. As the next step there, we then need to go into preparation, because most of the time, if we just ingest the data, there's going to be some kind of like quality issues with the data. There might be some data missing, etc. So we first need to ensure that it is of good quality and do any kind of preparatory steps to be able to fully use that data source that we want to work with. But oftentimes just preparing isn't enough. We most of the time also want to do some kind of transformations as well. So transformations in comparisons to preparation is when we take the data and make something new out of it, whether it is that we take another data source and we combine this data with it, or we run some kind of aggregates or kind of combine the data in a new way. Whereas the preparation is just kind of cleaning it, prepping it, but not really yet drawing anything new from that. And between all of these steps, from ingestion, our data goes into the storage layer. Once we've prepared it, it goes back into the storage layer. And once we've transformed it, it returns to the storage layer. So that's kind of the foundation for the entire platform. After transformation, we then need to do the serving. So have the data available for some kind of end user to use, or like an end process. So that could be an application, it could be a machine learning model, it could be many, many things. But in this case, I have, as the last box here, I have visualization, just because that's one of the main use cases we often work with in the beginning, especially. If we don't yet quite know what to do with our data, visualization is the first good step, because it allows us to see our data in useful ways. And so where does Azure Synapse Analytics work in this flow of creating a data platform or a data platform workflow? Azure Synapse Analytics really answers the needs for all of these steps, all the way from ingesting the data from the data source, all the way to visualization. And as we did see that there are many, many pieces that are included in this Azure Synapse Analytics, so we do need to understand what each of those pieces is for. What step are they taking care of? But before we go into that, there are some kind of common ground for all of those components. And what is common to all of these and within Azure Synapse Analytics is that we have, for example, the Azure Synapse Studio, which is the graphical user interface that we can use to work with all of those components of Azure Synapse Analytics. We can create our pipelines, we can work with the serverless SQL pool. It doesn't matter. We have this visual interface that we can use for working with all the components. Secondly, what is common to all of this is the monitoring. So since all of these components have been wrapped into one service, all the monitoring is centralized in one place. So if you compare to like a previous life in Azure creating a data platform solution, you would need to pick things like Data Lake and Data Factory and SQL and so forth. And then to monitor those, you would need to go to each of those services separately. And as we are now within one service, that all that monitoring data is within that Azure Synapse Analytics workspace that you create. And lastly, the last portion here is the management. That is also kind of centralized into this one service. All the management operations can be done from within Azure Synapse Analytics to all the different components. So as we now are going to move into kind of walking through all of the different components, keep that in mind. Those three components are always going to be shared for all of these. They are shared in one of these Azure Synapse Analytics workspaces. So you have the Azure Synapse Studio, the monitoring is centralized as well as the management. So now we're going to start going a little deeper. So if we look at an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, what we can find there is kind of three different layers. We have the data layer. We then have the orchestration layer. And lastly, we have the analytic engines layer. So we can kind of roughly categorize the main components of Azure Synapse Analytics into these three parts. So if we start from the bottom, from the data portion here, within there, what we have is Azure Data Lake Storage. And it's kind of, I'm not sure if it's kind of like officially integrated into Azure Synapse Analytics, but you need to have an Azure Data Lake Storage to get started with Azure Synapse Analytics. And then that gets integrated into it. So it is an essential part, and this is what acts as central storage for all of our workflows that we do. And this is kind of what we use as the central data location for our data platform. With the orchestration layer, that is where we can find the pipelines. So this is what we can use for doing all of the data movement. It doesn't matter whether we're moving it from outside of Azure into Azure, or from Azure to outside of Azure, or just within Azure itself. And we can create all kinds of complex scenarios with the pipelines. And there's actually sessions later on today on the pipeline section. So I'm not going to go into the details, but you'll be able to get that information later today. And as the last portion here is where we have the most options, so the analytic engines. We start with some SQL flavors. So as the first one here, we have the serverless SQL pool. And this is a SQL engine that we are able to use on demand. So whenever we need it, we can run SQL queries, and we can not only run it against relational data, but we can run it directly against Azure Data Lake Storage. And I believe this is kind of the really neat thing within Azure Synapse Analytics that you couldn't have achieved in Azure before this so easily. Here you can just directly run a query against the data that you have in Azure Data Lake Storage. And especially if you're really used to working with SQL language, the T-SQL, that will make your job a whole lot easier, not having to move the data around before being able to query it. So that's the part I'm really excited about. As the second SQL flavor here, we have the dedicated SQL pools. And this is now the old data warehouse. So if you worked with the Azure Data Warehouse previously, anything that you know from that world will still apply to this. And so the dedicated SQL pool is a fully fledged database, and that is really for those data warehouse scenarios because you have the multi parallel processing engine behind it, which is really good for then spreading out the queries to the multiple compute nodes and getting back the data. So that is really optimized for those scenarios. And if you're like building a fully fledged data warehouse, you are probably going to need the dedicated SQL pool component there to make that use case come to life. So there are a bit of differences between the serverless SQL pool that is on demand Whereas on the other hand, the dedicated SQL pools is dedicated, as it is said, in the sense that you do specify a certain capacity that you're going to use. And then you can, of course, scale that capacity and even stop the engine entirely and start it again. So you do have control over it. So it's not just running 24/7 a month. But, you know, the pricing is different. The dedicated SQL pools is per the capacity that you specify, whereas the serverless SQL pool is per processed amount of data that you run through the queries there. So they are slightly different services there. And then as the third option here, we have this Apache Spark pools. So this is a different flavor. This is a Spark flavor. And this is what allows you to run very much the Spark-based notebooks and things like that within Azure Synapse Analytics. It is, again, more a kind of a dedicated style. So you do specify a capacity that you're going to use, but then you can have some automation for starting and stopping the cluster and so forth. But that way you end up with these 3 different flavors that you're able to use for the analytics side. We'll get into more discussions when you would use one or the other going forward here. And so now if we take a step back and think about how does this all fit into that data platform workflow that we talked about in the beginning? Well, if we kind of zoom out and look how it fits, the data layer, which was the Azure Data Lake storage, that goes directly in the store layer in the bottom to make the foundation as the central part where all our data ends up. But then the analytic engines, those can be used all the way from like the preparation phase, the transformation, and even serving. For example, you can use the dedicated SQL pool for serving the data. But then the orchestration, that is what drives all the phases, all through from the ingestion all the way to getting the data to the serving layer as well. You might notice here that we also have the visualization box a little empty, so there's not yet anything there. And so that is where you could integrate Power BI with Azure Synapse Analytics and just kind of combine the power of Power BI and Azure Synapse Analytics and have even your visualizations controlled through Azure Synapse Analytics as well. So you can bring that into the mix too. So there you have it. We've had an overview of Azure Synapse Analytics, and you know now the main components and what their functions are. And we're now going to go more kind of to the architecture side and start looking at how you secure Azure Synapse Analytics. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at 2 aspects of security. We're going to be looking at networking and access control. And when we're talking about networking, we're going to focus on 2 different things. So when we talk about networking, we're asking the question and trying to ensure that this is answered properly. We're asking the question of, can I get to my destination? Can I reach it? But also, as the other portion here, we're talking about which route should I take to get to my destination. So networking is really talking about what direction does the traffic go to and does it get to the destination that it's trying to. And in that sense, we're looking, of course, like, is this traffic allowed to get there or is it not? So we need to consider those aspects. On the access control side, we're talking about, can I get in after I've reached my destination? And then secondly, we're talking about what can I do once I've actually gotten in? So those are the aspects we're going to talk about in this section. Let's start with networking. So I'm going to kind of simplify the picture a little bit here. We're going to be talking about our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And as with most platform as a service services within Azure, we start off with having a public endpoint for our service. And when we have that public endpoint, we do have some control over what kind of traffic gets in. It's not so that you just need to allow all traffic to come in just because you have a public endpoint, but we do have a firewall here that we can use. And within that firewall, we have some settings. And the settings that we have available there is we can, for example, allow Azure services to access our Synapse Analytics workspace, but we can also do whitelisting of different IP addresses. So in certain scenarios, this might be completely sufficient for your setup to just, okay, it has a public endpoint, but we're just going to control all the traffic with the firewall settings, and that is totally enough. But in some scenarios, especially if you go into the enterprise scene, you might get quite higher kind of requirements for the security side, and there might be just requirements that no public endpoints should be used at all. So we also need to be able to adapt to that kinds of situations. And so one way we can work around that is by using something called managed workspace virtual network. And so what that does is that we get a managed virtual network, which we don't necessarily see or we cannot control or so forth, but it is managed by Azure Synapse Analytics for us. And when we create a managed workspace VNet, the Spark pool side gets linked to it directly. But actually, because the serverless SQL pool side and the dedicated SQL pool side, they run on the multi-tenant platform side, they need to be linked to that managed workspace VNet explicitly. So you need to do a linking. And what will be used for that is managed private endpoints. So if you worked with Azure PaaS services before, you might have used the private endpoints with just your own virtual networks. So here it is very similar. These are just managed private endpoints, so that just means that they get linked to that managed workspace VNet itself. But actually, what happens here is that even though you create this managed workspace VNet, you still have one endpoint available, kind of a public endpoint. And that is the endpoint that connects to the web user interface. And so if your requirements are even kind of more restricted, and you need to even have that web user interface secured, then we need to take again a step further. So this might also be the kind of scenario where you want to kind of have this web user interface linked from so that you can use it from on-premises or from somewhere within Azure as well. So what you need to do in that case is you need to create a virtual network in Azure, which is your own virtual network, and then to link your virtual network to that web user interface, you need to create something called Synapse private link hub. Sorry, I'm still having a little difficulty saying that word. So Synapse private link hub, that's what you need to create. And that allows you to route your traffic from your virtual network to the web user interface. And to have really that link between your virtual network, you need a private endpoint there as well to be connected to that Synapse private link hub. So as you can see, it gets a little more complex if you want to secure everything kind of very securely. And there's just a few little details missing from this picture as well, but just to get you the idea of what components you need and how you need to set this up. But after you have this set up, then you could have your virtual network connected to your on-premise site, and your developers could access the Synapse Studio from within your own network on premises. So after this, it would be really easy to use all of the components privately. All right. So we walked through how you can just secure the private endpoint. I mean, the public endpoint that you have for your Azure Synapse Analytics workspace in the beginning, or you can go with using the managed workspace VNet. And currently, you still have to note that once you choose one or the other option, that cannot yet be changed on the fly. We'll see if that does become available. But right now, you need to decide which way you're going to go. Okay. Then we're going to be moving on to the second portion of the security side, so access control. And so when you're creating your Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, you might already notice that there's quite a lot of talk about RBAC roles, etc. when you're doing that, because it's telling you, for example, that, well, the workspace identity will get the storage gen 2 account, storage blob data contributor role, and then you need to do these assignments to other users as well. And what does this all actually mean? What do you need to do? So of course, it's easy if you're just doing a demo for yourself or playing around. You just create it and you have all the needed credentials right away from the beginning. So it's really easy to get started. But of course, when you get more people working in there, then you need to know how to handle this access control side as well. So if we again take a look at our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, it kind of was implied in the previous screenshot, but we have two layers of access control. We have the Azure RBAC, and as the second portion, we have the Azure Synapse Workspace roles. So actually, we have two layers of access control available, and that changes it a little bit. So we have the Azure RBAC, which is to the management layer side. So this is the RBAC roles that you might be familiar with using from just working with Azure. We have the three main roles, which are the owner, we have the contributor, and we have the reader. And there are, of course, some service-specific roles available in Azure RBAC as well, but these are the main three roles. And this is for really the people who are going to manage the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace from the kind of infrastructure side. So for example, creating SQL pools, etc., things like that. And so with the owner credential, you are going to able to do everything that could be done in Azure actually, but also give access to other users as well to the Azure RBAC roles. In the contributor role, you can do everything, but you cannot grant access to other people. And in the reader role, you're just going to be able to see what has been done. You're not going to be able to do anything specifically. When we then look inside the Azure, wait, never mind, one step back. We're going to just look one thing closer here. So with these Azure RBAC roles, since we do have these different analytics engines available within the Azure Synapse Workspace, these are the ones that with the Azure RBAC roles, if you have the required credentials, you're going to be able to manage these, and that's the keyword. So that really means you're going to be able to create, you're going to be able to modify them, you're going to be able to start and stop them, etc. So those are the kinds of aspects that you're going to be able to manage. Then as we walk inside the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace itself, that is where we have the Azure Synapse Workspace roles. And again, there are currently three main roles. There are some other roles in preview as well, but let's just walk through the three main roles at this point. So we have the Workspace admin, we have the Spark admin, and we have the SQL admin. And so currently how this works is that the Workspace admin, this is the person who can do everything. So they're going to be able to create pipelines. They are able to do development on both SQL and Spark, and pretty much anything within the workspace itself. If we, in contrast, look at the Spark admin, the Spark admin is only going to be able to do development on Spark, whereas the SQL admin is going to be able to do only development on SQL. And it's really essential that you keep your workspace admin as is, because I have for myself, when I was testing things out back in the day, I managed to lock myself out of my Synapse Analytics workspace because for some reason, I can't remember why. I think it might have been just for testing reasons, but I removed the workspace admin. And after that, even if you're an Azure RBAC owner, you cannot log in because the workspace admin is the person who has access inside the workspace. So that really distinguishes like who can log into the Synapse Studio. Those are the people with these workspace admin roles, and who can then do the management from within the Azure portal or any other tools that you might use to manage Azure. Those are the Azure RBAC roles. And of course, the more you have a team around you, the more you need to consider these aspects. So now we've been walking through first the components of Azure Synapse Analytics, and now also the security portion from the networking and access control side. And we have the last portion left here. So the last portion is we're going to be looking at how to use Azure Synapse Analytics. And so we've been here walking through first the components, really kind of understanding what is each of those Azure Synapse Analytics components for, what is their purpose, what are they capable of, etc. And we'll kind of get into a little more detail here as well in regards to that point. We've also looked at how to do access management and also networking. So the question is, how do we use all this? Like, which components do I choose? How do I set up the access control? How do I do the networking in my specific scenario? That is always the question we're going to ask. Since we don't have a full day for this, we definitely could use a full day for this, but I'm just going to walk through one example, how you might approach looking at that scenario. So we're going to have one example here. So we're going to have a scenario where there are multiple data sources, and these are both from SaaS applications and also from internal networks. So some of these kind of data endpoints can be reached via the internet, but some are secured privately. And within these data sources, we have many different types. So we have some relational databases, but we also have some structured data, so things like Jigsaw and XML and so forth. But we then also can have some completely non-structured data. So things like videos, photos, etc., and so forth. So we have many, many different data sources. And of course, we want to bring that data in and we want to do something about it. And in this case, we're just gonna be looking at a scenario where we want to do just reporting and data science as well on that data. And we have a team that actually has like multiple people and teams that are working on different aspects. So there is one team handling the management of the infrastructure side, and there's other teams that are working on the data itself. So if we look at this process again, how are we going to put the different Azure Synapse Analytics components in there? So we have our data sources, which we now know are these different types. Those are what we're going to be pulling in. And to start off, when we're, of course, starting off, we need to have Azure Data Lake Storage linked to our Azure Synapse Analytics. That is kind of the piece that we need. We cannot get started without it. It is actually the one thing that is asked when you create Azure Synapse Analytics. You need to have an Azure Data Lake Storage. The other component that you get out of the box is the pipelines. And that's what you need to have for the data movement side. So really have it for the ingestion phase. You are going to need that in that portion. So as the first part here, you are going to start off with those two components. And after that, you get to decide what you're going to need in addition. So with the pipelines, we're first going to take the data in the ingestion phase and store it in the Azure Data Lake Storage. As we're starting to do some preparation, we are going to start with the serverless SQL pools, because we're going to first do some exploration of our data, and that is just really fast to use, and we know SQL and so forth, so that is what we're familiar with. So we're just going to use that to do any data cleaning, or also just look at our data and see what kind of cleaning might be needed. In the next phase, when we're going to do the transformation, we're going to say that we have a team that is really good at Spark. So that's what they've been using previously, and that's what they are familiar with. So for the transformation phase, they're going to use Spark notebooks. And again, they're going to connect to the Azure Data Lake Storage. They're going to do the transformations, and then the data gets written back into the Azure Data Lake Storage. And yes, there is also this aspect that since you're going to move your data out of Azure Data Lake Storage. And then again, you need to have some structure to your Azure Data Lake Storage to really make that work well. Then on the serving layer here, we're going to use the dedicated SQL pools. You could have other options here as well, but in this scenario, we're going for more traditional star schema style modeling in this phase for our visualization and reporting purposes, because it's going to be like heavy usage. We need a lot of compute power, so that is what we're going to go for. So again, the data is going to get moved from Azure Data Lake Storage to the dedicated SQL pools and loaded into that schema that we want to have in there as the last phase. And then since we were going to do some reporting, we're going to have Power BI linked into Azure Synapse Analytics as the visualization layer. So that is, of course, one part of it, just deciding which component are you going to use for each of these steps. And depending on the person you're going to ask, you're going to get different answers. Some people prefer sticking with SQL. If they've never used Spark, it can be a bit of a leap. But then if somebody has used Spark all of their life, they're going to say, well, you can do everything with Spark. You are not going to need the serverless SQL pools at all. We can do all the preparation, exploration, everything with Spark. That is not needed. So it will often depend on who you ask for an opinion, which part you should use. And of course, you need to consider what you are really doing with your data. So what is the best service for a particular thing? But you need to also consider what is your team proficient in, because if they're not proficient in something, the learning curve is going to be a little bit longer to get started. So, and remember also with this that you can kind of add piece by piece. So if you start just with the Azure Data Lake Storage and pipelines, you could get started with just using the serverless SQL pools and nothing else. And you could run with that as far as you can, and then only then start using the other components once you realize that, well, this is not going to fit to our purposes. But serverless SQL pools can process a whole ton of data. So it's not going to kind of come to each edge because of the amount of data that you have. All right. So that was the one aspect that we need to consider. The other aspect that we really need to think about is the security side. Once, especially, we start to work with multiple teams, we need to consider the access control, plus, of course, we need to consider the networking. So here we were working with data sources on premises, and we're assuming that we have kind of this enterprise scenario where we have tight security requirements, really tight. We need to be able to access all our data internally through internal networks and so forth. So that means we do need to start with a managed workspace VNet. And to also secure that web user interface, we're going to use the Synapse Private Link Hub, as we kind of walked through in more detail previously. And then, of course, if you want to link this all the way to your on-prem site, you can do that. Once we have the private endpoints in place, we can connect all the way from your organization networks, and we could have those connected with a VPN or express route with your Azure virtual network, where you have the linking to the Synapse Private Link Hub. So that would allow you to get both into the Synapse Studio, but also then working with the different analytic engines privately as well. And so, of course, then your users would be at the organization network side. All right, so what we've been talking about today is that we first walk through the components of Azure Synapse Analytics as the first portion. And so this means that you now have a good sense of what the different components are. And I think especially with this event, this is really neat because there are so many sessions coming up that will then go into the details. And that's exactly what this session is for, to give you the big picture of Synapse Analytics, so that as you go into the following sessions, you then get to deep dive into those single components exactly. And now you kind of have this map in your mind that you can then fit all those details into. Secondly, we walk through securing Azure Synapse Analytics, networking, and access control specifically, because those are, I think, the minimum things you should consider when you're thinking about networking. Security. You should be at least thinking about networking and access control. And there are quite clear guidelines on how to do that, and you can find even kind of walkthroughs of how to get that set up working that we talked about with the managed VNet and the private link hub and so forth. You can walk through that yourself as well. And lastly, we also talked through one example. We talked about how to use Azure Synapse Analytics in your scenario. And the key point there is really to look at what are your requirements, what kind of environment are you working in, how many users do you have, what kind of data sources are you working with, and what will be the phases of that data platform workflow that we talked about and how you're going to use that. And by really kind of systematically looking through your requirements and going through them one by one, that is what will allow you to really choose the services that you need for your platform for yourself, because that way you're going to be able to narrow down which of the Azure Synapse Analytics components you're going to use. Because even though it's one service, it's still many pieces in there, and there are different skill sets that you need for using each of those components. Like for pipelines, you don't need the same skill set as for working with Azure, the serverless SQL pool. So you need to kind of decide and pick and choose. And especially if you have a smaller team, it is often easier to start kind of small and contained and not try to use everything all at once, but get started and get rolling. And then after a while, you can expand the components that you use. And since they are in one package, it is easier to start using the other components going forward as well. So I hope with this session you were able to get that overview that you were hoping for, and you've gotten excited to really get out there and start using Azure Synapse Analytics. And really know that it's kind of the perfect time to get started, because the service is still so new and there are so many exciting things happening and new capabilities coming in all the time. It's like the perfect time to get rolling and understanding all of the different components that are included there. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you enjoyed that.